just like, oh, that, yeah. I can understand the whole dynamic is very different as a white person just looking. It's like,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
No.
Man, I didn't expect we would get into like freaking celebrity gossip today.
Yeah,
we normally don't do this.
Race politics. Let's go. Welcome to Modular Components, everybody. I'm one of your hosts, the Humanator, and as always, I'm joined by the king of the rags, Boingo Rider.
Hi, I'm currently in a lo-fi sounding dimension. I'm sorry for this.
Oh, that's fine. You're just off traveling through the cosmos. It's cool. Just like it's always cool to have Snowcone 83 here.
That's me. I'm in Florida.
You're in Florida?
How's that different from any other week?
It's different because of off mic jokes. Also, how are you doing, Buster Corp?
Not good.
Oh,
I'm just gonna be blunt. I'm feeling better, but like today has not been it, man. Today has not been it.
Well, that's not great. But you know what is great? Doing guest episodes. I love doing guest episodes. I love having guests on the podcast. So why don't you introduce yourself, our special guest this week?
Well, hello, everyone. It's a great honor to be guesting on here, and I've got a very different voice, perhaps, than usual. But my name is Richard Carrier, and I am the creator of Cleverdix Films' YouTube channel, where I make very in-depth and laboriously verbose videos about Doctor Who.
Yeah, I think you're probably the first British guest we've ever had on here, primarily because of the time difference.
I'm glad you're saying that, because I kind of stumbled over that, and I'm glad that it's accurate.
No, it's fine. Yeah, it's really interesting to have you on the channel because of not only differences in cultural understanding we have about certain things, but also we just don't talk about Doctor Who that often on the channel, which is kind of funny because one of the first attempts at a show we had was a revival of an old Doctor Who review podcast I used to do, and I've been a large fan of the program for a long time, and Boingo is too, but we just don't get that many opportunities to talk about it. So well,
there's been so much happening in the sort of pop cultural landscape, hasn't there, over the last few years? And Doctor Who hasn't. I mean, it's been there, but it hasn't necessarily been above the wave, so to speak. Especially perhaps in America. But perhaps this will be a sign of things to come, because obviously there's the big anniversary specials coming up next month, and then the new big series. And the BBC co-production with Disney Plus, so perhaps the profile will become a little bit bigger.
They're really trying to make it a big thing again, it seems. What with basically doing the old, just go right back to the things that made it super popular last time that happened. You got Russell T Davies show running again. You got David Tennant playing the Doctor again. You even got friggin' Catherine Tate coming back as Donna Noble.
I mean, if we can be honest, it's bringing me back to at least watch the special. So it's doing its job. It's getting the last fans who really liked that era and just kind of fell off with the next era of Doctor Who to come back and give it another shot.
I found myself watching like a compilation of what was the detail it was talking about? Just like the callbacks and stuff like that, and detail with that character leading up to this, like stuff, like all the different appearances with the past Doctors, just like educating me on that, because the trailer seemed interesting and it actually stopped me from continuing forward on a video. I was like, well, let me watch this real quick. This looks interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the most marked differences from the last few years has been the I don't know if even to call it sophisticated, the marketing, but the fact that there is marketing, the fact that it is using social media and really embracing that.
Big
and,
bang! Gotta get the nostalgia bucks in, all that good stuff.
Yeah,
now, if they actually wanted to get my nostalgia bucks in, they should have done a cheesy Disney XD parody. Did I ever tell you guys about that time? I think it was during the 50th anniversary where Disney XD just got Doctor Who for like 2 months.
No, what? I've never heard about this. What?
Yeah, they had like.
I've seen the TV spots for it.
Yeah, the TV spot where they just made up this theme song for it, like it's always been there. And I'm like, what do you mean by this? This is like spooky. It's like
I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, I think it was an American thing.
Mm.
Let me see. I'm linking it here.
I mean,
for
here's the
later
thing.
reference.
Oh,
Disney XD in America also had Naruto Shippuden.
Yeah, true. They tried some weird stuff in the early days of that channel, and now it's just basically
Too
there.
Disney again. It's just too Disney again.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
Toon Disney 2. But like that's besides me watching the Matt Smith and liking what I've seen of the Seventh Doctor, this is my most exposure to Doctor Who. And besides hearing people I like talk about it.
Mm.
What have you seen of the Seventh Doctor, Buster? I don't think I've ever heard you even mention him before.
I saw his first appearance, and then I've just seen like bits and clips and just retrospectives on his appearances. Like I'll specifically seek out retrospectives and I'll be like, yeah, this is a cool guy. Can't wait to watch him one day. Huge Seventh Doctor fan, excited to watch his series for the first time.
Well, if you watch Time and the Rani, the Seventh Doctor's debut, and you were interested in watching more, then you've done a lot better than a lot of other people. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that was that's why I kind of like skipped around. It's just because it's like, yeah, this is kind of like I know he's gonna do cool shit, but also that's kind of a boring episode.
And I mean, while it is rewarding to watch Doctor Who in order and keep up with it, it is one of the few franchises that I think you can kind of watch in any order and still have fun if you like it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that's partly to do with, unlike in a way, it is literally a legacy of an earlier time of television when there weren't story arcs. There weren't, it wasn't prestige television. It was a weekly thing, and in fact, for the first almost 20 years of its existence, the nature of television production meant that you would see it on the night it went out, or you wouldn't. And then if you didn't, you were likely never to see it again because it might not be repeated. There were union laws about how many times a program could be repeated on television because it would be taking away work from actors making new productions. So very few, before home media came along, and that really changed the landscape where people could, buy these things and pore over them. And as a result, even though modern Doctor Who is a modernized version, it still bears some of that legacy when it comes to its narrative style. So despite anniversary specials are obviously going to be quite self-indulgent and self-referential, but at the same time, if they're done well, I think this is kind of true of any show really, apart from maybe like the finale of a program. You should be able to jump on and get the fundamentals and just get into the individual story.
Yeah. Was there like a bootleg market of Doctor Who VHSs before it became the home media?
There were. That's true. Yeah. Well, people had VCR. VCRs came around, but they were very expensive, and so were the cassettes to purchase. The first Doctor Who VHS was a Tom Baker Cyberman story, and when it retailed, it was about £100, which would be probably about $150, I think, at the time, equivalent.
So at least
they
guys had a very unhealthy, uncost-effective home media market. We were introducing you a little bit to Kamen Rider before we started the show because that's just how things go here. But one thing that Kamen Rider fans always talk about with Japanese culture is, well, one, it's hard to get it over in the States because obviously it's in another language, so it has to be subtitled, and a lot of the way it gets subtitled is by fans doing it and releasing it in websites.
Special ways.
The special methods, as we like to call them here. But when it does get official home media in its own country, Japanese Blu-rays are so insanely expensive that you'll get like a DVD of the first 5 or 6 episodes of something, and that'll be like $50. And that still persists to this day.
Well, that's also because there's still a heavy rental market in Japan.
That's true.
It's interesting, isn't it? You'd think with streaming and everything that would die to death a bit.
Well, it's starting to curve towards streaming more over there.
But like rental culture was such a big thing in Japan. They rented music CDs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is that because of I mean, I you have to pardon my ignorance about Japanese culture, but I get the impression that a lot of Japanese culture is quite high on minimalism, and that idea of acquiring tons of physical media might not be possible or appealing. Perhaps that's just me conjecturing.
I could see that
probably
easily being true.
Yeah, that's part of one. That's one part of it, but there's also just the recording industries and the publishing industries in Japan push for certain ways to do rentals and stuff. And so it's just it's legacy. Like you can't rent a video game. You can't rent video games for some reason.
Maybe
because
it's just because how they view it as a media.
Yeah, right. It's because it is viewed as like a more of a program than just a entertainment piece. And that's why Nintendo, Square, Enix, Falcom, I think even too, like the big video game companies in Japan where it's like, hey, don't rent because the code itself is our intellectual property and you're not buying that.
Right.
So.
Well, I mean, yeah, talking about people from other countries wanting to follow different methods to get hold of copies of media. I mean, part of the thing that drove the sort of bootleg Doctor Who VHS for a long time was the fact that because there wasn't the scope for repeats or home media, although I mean, if they'd spoken to anyone in the technical industry, they probably would have worked out that sooner or later it would have been possible for people to have home media. But nevertheless, the BBC just routinely deleted programs. So after they were recorded on videotape, this is old school videotape of pre-VHS, they would then be shown, and then they would overwrite them because they needed to reuse the videotape. Because it was very expensive. What they used to do was to take essentially they'd play it on a screen and they'd point a 60mm film camera at it and record it. And then they would send those film prints all around the world to be transmitted in different Commonwealth countries like Australia, New Zealand, places like that, Singapore. And
was Canada still part of that at that time?
Yes, it was. Although I think the Canada didn't really. I might be wrong, but I don't think Canada started showing Doctor Who until the 70s. But the nature of these
more like trying to get sure my brain right, my memories. Don't worry, good going.
Yeah. So these film prints would make their way around the world and be shown and this carried on for many years. They'd be bicycled from one country to the next, and sometimes they'd arrive at the end destination, and then the command was that they should be destroyed or returned to the BBC. So the long and short of it is that by the 80s, when people started getting home media, the BBC couldn't release a lot of these classic Doctor Who stories because they simply didn't exist in their holdings anymore. But many of them did exist abroad, and they might still be being shown because it had literally taken that long for it to get to that country to show the episode from, say, 10 years before. And then someone might record it in that other country, and then they do 12th generation copies of these original videotapes they'd recorded off their TVs, and then they would send them around the world for this bootleg market. So that's part of the reason.
That's how a lot of early stories ended up getting lost and then found again, right?
Yeah, well, a lot of them made their way back to the BBC in the 1980s when people actually started sitting down and going, hang on, we've got these massive gaps in the collection, and this is a bit of a tragedy. So they sort of put feelers out, and there were different people involved, some official BBC people, some sort of doing it voluntary, who would acquire find film prints that had ended up in a film studio, hadn't been destroyed, hadn't been sent on, hadn't been returned to the BBC. And so slowly you get this trickle through the 80s and 90s of stories that had been deleted by the BBC but came back in. That was pretty much the entirety of the 60s era had been destroyed. And now we've got a lot back, and that's why a lot of people are very excited this year, because it being the 60th anniversary, hoping that another story might be found and find its way back. And there's been several points in the history of Doctor Who where we've thought, oh, there can't be any left now. They'll have degraded, and I mean, a film is a it's not like digital. It degrades. The film will slowly turn to vinegar and get all stuck together, and all kinds of things will happen to it. But then 10 years ago, one of the largest returns of classic Doctor Who happened on the 50th anniversary. There was a whole Patrick Troughton story returned of 6 episodes, and
I remember
all the other
the day that
episodes of
news
another
broke.
story.
That was like that was like pandemonium swept across the internet for a day.
Well, yeah, it was big. It was big, because not only was it a story that was missing, it was a story that, in particular, the Web of Fear, the Patrick Troughton Yeti story, is the first story with the Brigadier, or the character that goes on to be the Brigadier, who's a major character in the history of the show. That came back. We only had one episode of that in existence, and most of it came back. One episode apparently went missing. It was found, but then went missing in its transit back to the UK. And there's lots of conspiracy theories about that, which I won't go into. But most of it was found, and so it was a fantastic. It couldn't have come at a better time. I'm sure the BBC held on to it for a little bit before releasing the news to coincide it with the 50th anniversary. But people were kind of hopeful that there'd be another discovery ahead of the 60th. But I think we're cutting it a bit fine now.
Yeah. Oh man, if a new story were to be found, like in its entirety, which one do you think you would most like to see turn up now?
Well, I think the one I would like the most, and probably the one that's most likely to, if it was to happen, is a William Hartnell story called Marco Polo, which is a historical story. In the 60s, they used to alternate between science fiction and historical, and obviously they still do stories where the Doctor goes into the past now, but they tend to be called pseudo-historical because they always tend to have an alien or some nefarious extraterrestrial involved. But at first they had sort of pure historicals, as they're called, where it was just the Doctor goes to a particular historical period, whether it be like the Aztecs or the French Revolution, and get involved in the historical shenanigans. So this story is a very early, it's the first missing story, if you see what I mean. Like it's not the first story, but there's the stories we have prior to it still exist. We have those ones, and it's quite very well thought of. But you do tend to have that with missing stories because we don't have it. The story tends to take on a kind of mythic status in the fans' imagination. It tends to be seen as this, it must be brilliant and fantastic. If only we could see it. And then sometimes these stories come back and we see them and go, yeah, it's not quite as good as we thought. But this one, by all accounts, yeah, exactly. There's a lot of photographs from when they were filming it. You could see like the sets and the costumes and things like that. And the one fortunate thing, which I haven't mentioned, some people might not be aware of, is the fact that although there are quite a lot of stories from that era missing visually, we can listen to them, because before VCRs and VHS and all that kind of thing, a few enterprising fans had personal recording hardware, and they could, in fact, one of them, some of them would just literally put a microphone for their hi-fi system next to the television and record the episode, and that was their only way, basically, of rewatching, so to speak, the story. But then there was one gentleman called Graham Strong who he actually adapted his television so he could incorporate a microphone. He could take the sound directly from the audio output speakers, whatever, and record it. So we have these quite nice, clean recordings of all these missing stories, and they've all been released on CD or download with linking narration to make up for the lack of visuals. So we can experience these stories to some extent, but just not as they were originally intended. And of course there's animated reconstructions that they're still doing.
They've essentially been reduced to audiobooks of sorts.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. And of course, it's not brilliant because you'll have, say, the shooting script from which you can learn what the physical actions were, but without having the video, without having the visual, you lose a lot of what the performance would have been from the actors. And sometimes that can really change a story. Like there's one of the stories that came back in the 50th anniversary, was called Enemy of the World with Patrick Troughton. It was generally considered a bit of a boring story. We only had one episode, and unfortunately that one episode was the boring one. But then it all came back visually. Obviously, lots of people had heard it. They'd read the novelization, they'd read the script of it, but everyone still thought of it as this kind of not a very good story. And then when we got the full thing back and watched it, everyone was kind of amazed. It was really reappraised, because when you've got that visual element in, and you could see the actors performing the lines, it just completely changed it. So it's not perfect to just listen, but that's the only thing we can do with those ones that we don't have. So I'm very familiar with Marco Polo because I've heard it many times. Also for quite a few stories, directors back in those days, because they couldn't, take a piece of the recording and put it into their show reel like you would nowadays. What they would sometimes do is commission this guy who would essentially take photographs every few frames of not more than that, every few seconds, say, of an episode that you had directed, and you'd just get a sheet of these little photographs of the final images that you had composed as the director. And then you could show that to prospective employers and say, look, this is what I've done for the BBC. And those were called telesnaps. And so quite a few of those early stories have these telesnaps. So you can kind of get some idea of it. But, it still doesn't compare to what that final version would be. So as I say, it's the most likely one to be found. If they are to find an episode or a full set, it's probably going to be that one, because that was from the very first season, if you will, of Doctor Who, and it was the one. There was a batch of stories that was sent to all the countries that chose to screen it, and Marco Polo was a part of a lot of that first batch. Whereas later stories, sometimes foreign countries wouldn't take certain batches of stories. But lots of them got that, so it's most likely that they'll find that one. And but I don't know. I always cross my fingers, but I've been a fan of Doctor Who for a very long time, so I'm used to being disappointed with these things.
Yeah, I've always thought it would be great to find the rest of the Troughton era Dalek stories.
Oh yeah.
He's one of my favorite Doctors, so I've always just wondered what the actual visual element of his performance in those stories would be like.
Well, that's the thing as well. Is Troughton? Troughton is a very significant Doctor. I mean, they all are, but he's a very significant Doctor because he was the first one who had to pass the test of, can we change the lead actor and the character of the lead to some extent, and will it still survive? And because he proved that so successfully, in a way you could argue that he's one of the major reasons why the show has lasted as long as it has. Because, they've recast actors before in shows, but the idea of actually having it as part of the narrative, of having the character transform to some extent into a different person, is kind of unique, really, to Doctor Who. So, he proved that. And also the other aspect, as you say, is a real shame that so many of his stories are missing, more than any other Doctors, is that Troughton's performance is very physical, it's very visual.
Yeah, he's the guy who kind of made the Doctor a little more fun, a little more comedic initially, whereas Hartnell was very stern and Centaurian a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, he had his moments, his sort of crazy giggles and things like that. But you're right. He's more of the kind of stern and grumpy grandfather. Certainly when he starts, I mean, that's the fascinating thing, of watching Doctor Who through. Is certainly if you've come to it from modern era, going back and looking at the early ones, the Doctor is a very different character in his first few stories, at least, because the original dynamic was four ensemble leads of 4 characters, and although the show was called Doctor Who and it obviously focused the Doctor, he's very much not the hero beginning. He's more of in some ways he's more of an antagonist. I mean, in the first episode he abducts the 2 companion characters who are kind of the audience identification characters. And then in the second story with the Daleks, he sabotages his own ship in order to put them in a dangerous place, because he wants to go and investigate the city. In fact, in the first story, there's one point where they're dealing with this caveman, and he was chasing them. He's a kind of a baddie to them, but he gets mauled by some sort of lion, and the two companions, the two humans, decide that they're going to help him. And the Doctor at one point picks up a rock with a clear intention of stoving the head in of this caveman, because he doesn't want him to slow them down. He wants them dead so they can move on. So it's a very, very different character to what he goes on to be.
Yeah, he has to be sort of softened up and indentured to becoming a hero by the humans he travels with, which is one of the reasons why I think the show became so popular, both in its original run and in its new initial run, is they tried to replicate that somewhat with the Ninth Doctor, where he was very cold and closed off because of his experiences in the Time War, and Rose sort of like breaks open his shell over the course of that first series.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, like I hadn't actually thought. I mean, I agree. You know, Rose humanizes him in that way and reminds him of who he should be. But I hadn't thought of it in connection to what the original companions had done. I think probably because, like we were saying, how television is different. I don't think they necessarily intended that to happen, although it's certainly there, and you can read it in that the human companions kind of offer the Doctor in some way a kind of guidance as to how to be a better person, so that when they leave, when those first two companions leave, the Doctor then becomes more of the hero character, the lead hero, whereas the original hero arguably is the human male character Ian. He's very much positioned as the hero.
I mean, it's clearly not the intention of the show when it starts. The reason for the show existing was to fill time and teach kids about history and science. It just so happens that the writing kind of tended towards that direction, and I think the fact that it did is what allowed it to become popular back in its heyday. Is, you know, as people, we always like to see the positive side reflected in our media and get the self-affirmation of thinking like, yes, humans are good. We are a force for good in the universe. So seeing an alien interact with humans and go like, okay, I should try and be a better person because of the way they're acting, I think that struck a chord with people.
Yeah, and that's partly why I as a fan don't particularly like it's kind of been ignored and kind of retconned and different ways. In the 96 Paul McGann movie, they make the Doctor half human, and I said in my video about why I think that might be, but I don't like that idea. I mean, some people say, well, that's fine, that explains why he loves humans so much, but I don't really like that idea, because I don't like the idea that just because he or she shares a kind of genetic similarity, that's the only reason why we're impressive in some way. I like the kind of hopeful thing of that.
I mean, to kind of parallel, Superman doesn't need to be human to love humanity.
No, exactly. Yeah. And although he was brought up by humans, but he takes the lessons that he learned from that, the core values he learned from his stepdad. That's the one good thing I like, actually, about I mean, I won't get into a discussion about Zack Snyder verse or anything, but one of the things I liked in Man of Steel was that part when and I've only seen it the once, but it stuck with me, that when Pa Kent is saying about "you are my son" to him, you know, when he's a child and he's upset about the fact that, you know, he's not biologically his son, and he says, no, you are my son. And I like that, the idea of that adoption, that it goes beyond genetics and biology.
I've often said Man of Steel, and I don't know how much you are, because you don't talk about it much on your channel, but we're very much mainstream superhero fans here, and I've often said, like, Man of Steel is a rough but good start. It's everything that comes after that makes the Snyderverse an intolerable headache for me.
Yeah, I think it's got some good elements in there. I think the mass destruction of Metropolis at the end is a little bit over the top.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's some good, and I like Henry Cavill as well as that character.
And I just like the concept of doing an old school Hollywood alien invasion movie, but with Superman at the center of it.
Yeah, we're never gonna get Invasion as a movie though.
Yeah.
Oh look, it's the Oriental caricature aliens.
Oh no!
Yeah, when they did them on the CW, they had to make them like big insectoid weirdos.
Is that much better? I don't know anymore.
Nothing about the
I think
CW universe
the thing
is
though,
better.
actually, talking about that though is the fact that the Doctor in some ways is like a superhero, or at least some people like to think of the character as a superhero, and there's sort of different viewpoints on how quote unquote special the Doctor should be as a character within the narrative. Should he be a messiah like figure? Could he be a lonely god, or should he be a kind of bumbling eccentric who I kind of like the idea that a lot of what we see of the Doctor is kind of a facade, and talking about Troughton kind of very much nailed that. Hartnell was perhaps more of a human Doctor, probably because at that time it isn't actually definitively stated that the Doctor is an alien, rather than a human from the future or some sort of augmented human, until the Jon Pertwee era. Is it definitively stated that he's an alien? Even in Troughton's last story, when you learn about his people, the Time Lords, it doesn't definitively state that they are alien to humans. They could just be humans in the far future. Yeah, I mean, even in the original, because Doctor Who was quite unusual at the time. It's de rigueur now that you do a pilot episode, and you might you might use that as the first episode, or you might refilm it and change things. When Doctor Who was made in the 60s, that was very unusual. But they did do that, and in the original pilot episode, Susan says all kinds of things like "I'm from the 59th century" or something like that, and there were suggestions that they were on the run from an intergalactic war, and all these kinds of things, which were then taken out to add the mystery. Because I mean, the show really should have a question mark in the title, because it's who is the Doctor Who in that sense. But yeah, Troughton was the first one who really kind of like you say, he is more comedic, he's more sort of bumbling, but at the same time he has these wonderful moments where that kind of facade drops a little bit, and you get a sense of the far more calculating and savvy, thoughtful person beneath. And that's very much that's why, like you say, like that first Troughton story, Power of the Daleks, is a fantastic story. Unfortunately, we can't watch other than in an animated form. But that story is very much about who is this new Doctor, and he does come across even to his companions as this kind of bumbling fool, but actually he's carefully thinking behind the scenes, and he's very keen to fight the menace of the Daleks.
I will say this: I'm very much an American superhero comic book guy, so I tend to relate it back to like it's Spider-Man. He jokes around and goofs off to make you underestimate him, while he's going all right, I got to do this, that, and the other.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is that element, because like Spider-Man is a character who, obviously, when he's Peter Parker walking about, he has to almost lean into his childishness or whatever. But then as a superhero as well, he's kind of laissez-faire in some way, isn't he? He jokes around. I think the one of the big differences, of course, is the Doctor has always been perceived as someone very wise. I mean, they can be fallible, but someone who has a kind of a wisdom and an experience. Like from the very beginning, that idea of making the Doctor an old man, and even then, it's not said in the show, but it was in production paperwork that he was supposed to be several hundred years old. This idea that there's all this unseen story. Even in the very first story, there's mentions of other places they've been to, other planets, and you get this whole kind of backstory that isn't really isn't really fleshed out until many, many years later, because that's not really what's important. The point is that we're kind of joining and we're being whipped away on this adventure. There's not really an origin story for the Doctor. Many people have suggested
it needed to get to the point, and I think this is true of a lot of big franchises. You have to start off at a place of like where it is the most exciting. It has the most potential for adventure, and that gets people interested in it, so that at a certain point down the road, there is a strong enough fandom that people want to have that backstory fleshed out.
Yeah, that's true.
We didn't get the origin of Batman until like 4 comics after he first appeared.
That's true.
Yeah.
4 comics isn't a lot, though.
No, it's not, but it's like there is that element of media res that these kind of stories deal with.
Well, at the very least, you have to have some sort of context. I mean, you could have rare cases where they start, and that's like a specific utility they're using. They want to do it on purpose to make the story come at you in a certain way, but I think that's a pretty common thing.
Yeah, and back then you have to remember there's also like a very week-to-week, month-to-month turnover in the minds of the creative forces behind these things. It's as Richard said, it's not like today where we can see everything.
The readership as well is going to forget things, so that backstory and story arcs and things like that become less important. People want to follow a thing, but also, I mean, Doctor Who was made almost every week of the year. I mean, we now look back and kind of impose seasons and things on it, but really, Doctor Who was on every week, pretty much. It wasn't until the John Pertwee era where they started getting more like distinct, like you get 3-4 part stories and then a 6-part story or something like that. And then now, of course, you've got batches of 13 or 10 episodes a season. But in those days, it just went on, and because it was filmed, it was rehearsed all week and then filmed in one go on a Friday evening. So it was almost filmed as if it was live. It's just completely different with multi-cameras, not one single camera with different shots, and you just filmed it, and you had different parts of the studio with the actors on, and you'd cut from one bit to the other, and while you were filming one set of actors, the other actors would get into position. The cameras had to be choreographed so they didn't drive over each other's cables, and all these kinds of production issues. It was kind of real, like, flat out, and they worked, I think it was on like 43 or 44 weeks of the year, to the point where you do get stories where the Doctor or someone will just get bonked on the head and they'll go unconscious and they go, oh no, and then they're not in that episode, and it's because the actor was off on holiday for that week or something like that. So, it's a very different way of making television and consuming television than it is today.
It sounds a lot like a Broadway production or something like that.
Yeah, or like a repertory theatre or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I say, in one of my early videos, I say about it's quite important in some way to consider that the relationship between the audience and the television in the 60s and 70s is very different from ours now. Not necessarily in films, but in television. I think the line between film and television has blurred a lot more, certainly with the kind of modern prestige television things on Disney Plus, where a lot of those episodes of shows are probably more expensive than some films that come out these days. But we demand a kind of realism, even in our kind of fantasy. We want a kind of a realism to that. And in the 60s and 70s, people, I think, did watch television programs much like we would go to the theatre, where there's an understanding in the theatre that the audience have to use some of their own imagination to kind of fill in the gaps and ignore the wires when someone's flying about,
Yeah, in the early days of the medium, there wasn't a high enough fidelity in things like editing or special effects technology, and it wasn't inexpensive enough to really be able to apply it just yet. So people hadn't been led down that thought pattern, I think.
No, and I think also one of the things that I find fascinating, because I'd say that one of the things that I like to look at in my videos, rather than just reviewing the program, the narrative, is to look at the production side of it. And that's always something that's really fascinated me, because the contexts are very, very different, and how they did things. And Doctor Who was always used as a way to experiment with new technology. I mean, the theme tune was one of the first electronic songs that was ever really used in the popular in popular television. And the special effects, the experiment. I mean, there's even a story. I mean, it's terrible, this story. I'll just preview that. But there's a story in the 70s called Underworld, where it came towards the end of a season with Tom Baker, and basically they'd run out of money. And there's a whole kind of reasons for that, inflation and all kinds of things. But basically they couldn't afford to build the sets. And they said, well, we've got two choices. We either scrap the story or we come up with something. And so the first episode is sort of shot. They had enough money for some sets for the first episode, but then they're inside this sort of planetoid or sort of caves. And they just thought, well, why don't we use CSO, which is the color separation overlay, which was the BBC's name for what we now call blue screen or green screen. And so they did. They just filled a room with blue drapes or yellow drapes. For some reason, they used yellow in those days. And they just shot the actors and then video mixed in a kind of model, because they could afford the models, like miniatures of the sets, but they couldn't build the large ones. And, it's pretty terrible. It doesn't look great. And the story is not brilliant either. But
yeah, I'm looking at screen caps now.
Yeah. But if you think about the this is just before, that was made just before the original Star Wars was filmed.
Mm-hmm.
It's so like forward thinking. It's almost like they kind of stumbled about so that big studios in the future, in the 80s, when everything was blue, and now when you think about like the volume on The Mandalorian or Ahsoka or something like that, it's essentially the same process, just much more refined. So a lot of those things, they're very experimental and they're interesting from a production point of view, even if not from a story point of view. Saying that, I'm sure there's people that love that story, and they are welcome to their opinion, but
oh yeah, every story is somebody's favorite. But I was going to say that's one of the reasons, because we've talked a lot about Doctor Who, but we haven't talked a lot about your content so far. And one of the things I really appreciate about your videos and kind of endeared me to you right away was your sort of almost academic attention to detail about things, where it really does feel like you're watching a TV documentary a lot of the time. Your own opinions will sneak in here and there, but for a large part, you're trying to put things in a historical context, and that's something we don't see enough of on YouTube.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's something that
starting to see I'd argue we're starting to see like have a more resurgence of that stuff with like your defunct lands, and I'm trying to think of someone else. But like, well, defunct land is like the biggest, like closest example of I can compare their stuff to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's good, because I think when you take things, having I grew up with Doctor Who. I was born in the 80s, and although I don't really remember classic Doctor Who when it was on, I was always aware of it, so I don't really have a memory of discovering it. But I watched it when it was off the air, and at that time, as I've explained and alluded to in my videos, Doctor Who and science fiction and fantasy in general was thought of quite differently, I would argue, to how it is now. I think that now it's kind of become a bit more respectable, and that's not to say that it wasn't respectable then, but rather that people weren't willing to give it respect. It wasn't mainstream in that way, certainly not in England anyway. It was thought of as a geeky cult was the word they always use. It was a cult thing.
It wasn't. It wasn't until like.
To what?
Go ahead. Snowcone, you go.
To tie it back to what we were talking about earlier, it would definitely be something that even in the early 90s, early 2000s, for like us, would make us a point of the exact same kind of roasting you were talking about, maybe.
Yeah. There was that kind of, you were encouraged to feel a shame about it, and Doctor Who in a way became emblematic of kind of the worst, because you had things like Next Generation and Deep Space Nine on, and although people saw that as geeky and sci-fi and for nerds, it was seen as quality, whereas Doctor Who was seen as this kind of terrible, cheap program that had its day. Saying that, it had an enormous fan base that was a sort of underground who worked to ensure that it came back. Members of that fan base were the people who brought it back. But anyway, my point with this is that I was keenly aware from a very young age when I was watching these programs that they were out of date in a way. And so, I'd watch it, and other people that might be around in the room would kind of snigger at some of the special effects in things. And so in a way, I it wasn't just to kind of justify to them that what I was watching was quality by learning the contexts behind the production of it. But also it kind of intrigued me as to think, in a way, because I was very keenly interested in, how do you make television? How do you make movies? I went on to study media and then did a degree in film and media production. And that kind of started really with watching these programs. And because the special effects were a little bit dodgy and because I could see the wires, it kind of made it achievable to me. I thought, well, I'm aware by just looking at it that someone's made this, and that's fascinating to me. Whereas if everything is perfect, and you can't see the joins, so to speak, in special effects, in a way that's good because you completely immerse yourself in that fantasy world and almost kind of suspend your disbelief. But in another way, you kind of it's like a lot of people argue now about the difference between using models and using CGI, and both can look fantastic. But there's something about the physical model that just resonates with people on some level. When it's a model. Generally, when it's a model and when it's CG now, even today. And I think it's that tactile reality. You're aware that this is something that someone's created, and that really fascinated me. And so that then spurred me on to want to learn about how was this made. And then, of course, you've got such a long history of the program that you've got different production contexts for different periods. And you've also got wider kind of social, historical aspects that affect things. When you look at some of late 70s Doctor Who, you can go, well, this doesn't look as good as early 70s Doctor Who, so you can't make the excuse that, things weren't sophisticated because you'd seen it better before. But then you learn about the social history, and you learn about, like I mentioned, things like the inflation. We had hyperinflation in the 70s, had all these kind of political union disputes, and there were strikes by set designers and people that were working in the studios. And it's not just about finding like an excuse or a justification for why it's not as good as it could be. It's also fascinating in of itself because it's like a springboard to all these other interesting things. And so I'd spent so many years in a way in my life learning about these things. And I just, when I sat down and thought, I want to do a YouTube channel, what could I do it on? I thought I'll do it on Doctor Who, but I'll do it and kind of present this information that I've learned in an interesting way. Because at the time when I started, I couldn't really find anyone that was doing anything similar.
And that's, again, why I think your channel is so great, is you really do delve into the larger context for things and not necessarily provide an excuse for why things don't look great, but show the reason. And often your content tends to skew towards encouraging people to take Doctor Who as it is and going along with it in the way it's meant to be, rather than looking at it through a modern lens, which I think is a large part of why I've grown more in appreciation for the classic series, delving back into it over time. I still certainly haven't seen all of it, but I've found episodes or stories that I like, whereas before I was just like, I can't deal with the pacing back here. It's interesting to see isolated clips of each Doctor's performances, but I can't sit down and watch a whole story, was my attitude when I first got into it. And now I'm very much like, nah, if I've got the time, I'm going to sit down and watch Remembrance of the Daleks. That story rocks.
Well, I think also there was that element behind making my videos, was to kind of make it a bit, I'm aware that, although, as we've said, Doctor Who isn't something that you have to watch you don't have to watch every single episode. Although I do think it's worth watching the very first episode just so people can see where it came from.
Oh yeah.
But you don't have to see every single episode. And I'm certainly not one of these sort of gatekeepery people who go, well, you weren't a fan in those days, because there's always someone who's seen more. There's always someone who's been a fan for longer.
Well, you came into it during the wilderness years. There could always be people older than you going like, you weren't watching when Tom Baker's stuff was coming out. What do you know?
Well, exactly. And some people do try and argue that, but I remember funnily enough, I remember my grandmother once saying to me years ago, we were talking about D-Day, and I'd been studying it, and she was just sort of saying, well, you weren't alive then, you don't know what it was like. And I was thinking, well, fair enough, I wasn't around at the time like you were, but you weren't exactly on Omaha Beach either, Gran. So you can learn about things without necessarily having been in it, and also I think that Doctor Who is something that it has certain consistent iconography, and more importantly, the kind of the themes of the narrative, the kind of ideas that it grapples with, even in broad strokes. The idea of good versus evil to some extent. And if you've watched, say, just the Jodie Whittaker era, and you enjoy it and you love it for what it is, that doesn't make you any less of a fan than someone who's seen all of modern Doctor Who, or all of classic Doctor Who and modern Who. There's always more things to discover, and the show, it isn't one long. In a way, it's almost like a Schrodinger's cat kind of thing, in that it is one long story and narrative, but at the same time, it's something that has been added to and evolved and created and handed on from generation to generation. It's almost, I know it sounds like ridiculous hyperbole, but in some ways, it is becoming like a lot of modern fantasy, like you mentioned, superheroes, the comic characters. They've been around for going on 100 years now, and they are our modern folklore. They're as just as legitimate as Robin Hood and King Arthur and those kinds of legends of yesteryear. They're the same things, really. They're just modern examples of us as humans, exploring what it means to be human.
The interesting correlation between those two things, comic book superheroes and Doctor Who, is we're now at a point with both of those things where the people who worked on them in their original incarnation, most of them are no longer with us.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you really can't know what it was like to be around at that time.
Yeah.
No, well, my mother watched the very first episode, and she was, what was she? She was 10 or 11.
Yeah.
And I in my first video, I sort of mentioned that, because I thought it wasn't really about me watching it for the first time, but I knew her watching it for the first time. She had this sort of anecdote that she told me, which I kind of recreated for that. But, she certainly doesn't know as much about Doctor Who as I do, even though she was there at the beginning,
Yeah, but that's another thing I really like, is how you always have these very unique opening narrations that sort of set the tone for the lens to view this era through.
Well, part of that is a little bit. It's in a way, it's kind of emulating the modern the program, at least the modern era, with this kind of cold open. Because I knew I didn't want to make my own opening sequence and brand it in that way. I wanted each episode in some way to kind of evoke the era in which it's set. So why not use the opening? And you might notice that I only ever use music from that era in the background, because I don't want to kind of put it into a different lens. Like I say, I want to keep that context. But part of that is generally I kind of enjoy doing the opening bits probably more than the rest of the video, because that's generally where I get to be a little bit more creative. In fact, there's a little bit of an exclusive, because I haven't really mentioned this elsewhere. But for the upcoming anniversary, a lot of people are kind of champing at the bit. They want me to do the Peter Capaldi era, and I am gathering research and all that for that. But one thing I thought I'd do, because it's obviously the 60th anniversary, is one thing I've been meaning to do for a very long time now, is go back to the early videos and kind of update them and expand them a bit, because as I've made these programs and they've gone on, they've developed and become a bit more comprehensive than they were originally, because I wasn't sure if an audience would want the level of detail that now go into. So what I'm planning to do is go back and redo that first video with William Hartnell and kind of really expand it and develop it and obviously upgrade it. But I wanted the opening to be special. And every time I do a video, partly what I do is it's about kind of experimenting with something I haven't really done before. So the original William Hartnell video started with a kind of 2D PNG of a television from the 60s showing images from the time and then dissolving into the titles of the opening sequence. And I wanted to do that, but do a lot better. So I've spent about a month now recreating my grandparents' living room as it was in the 1960s with an authentic 1960s television in Blender. And I'm going to have a kind of a camera sort of zooming into the television, so it's kind of a 3D upscaled version of the original. So
that's crazy.
So you're kind of are you going to be doing sort of a version of your narration about your mother, but it's from Peter Capaldi's perspective?
No. I think when I do the Peter Capaldi video, I'm definitely going to do something about that, similar to what I did with the Tenant one, because I thought, well, the story really that runs through that episode is the fact that David Tennant was a fan.
Yeah,
became the Doctor.
One always gets me a little.
Yeah. That I was quite pleased to do it. I mean, I knew I was going to do something like that as soon as I saw a few years back, I think on Twitter, Georgia Tennant posted a photo of David Tennant recreating a childhood photo of him from a Christmas when he got some present. And so there's that photo of him as this young child with glasses on and very blonde hair. And I thought, well, I can use that image. So I kind of took that. I thought, well, I can have him watching Doctor Who on the television, have it reflected in his glasses, because I thought that's kind of the through line. It can be quite difficult sometimes because, the tendency, I suppose, could be that you just sit down and you just list everything that happened, every Doctor Who episode of that era. But that can be a bit clinical and a bit cold, and you want to try and create a bit of a story that runs through it. And I think with the Tenant one, I kind of hit lucky in a way, because Tenant has this fantastic story of that, he decided to be an actor because he was watching Doctor Who, and then he, by the time he became an actor, the opportunity wasn't there anymore because it wasn't on the air, and then it came back and he became the Doctor, and he not only became the Doctor, but he became, arguably the most successful Doctor, at least for the modern audience, next to Tom Baker.
Yeah, him and Tom are kind of tied for most iconic, I'd say.
Yeah. They both exist at a time. Funnily enough, they both exist. They both came about a time which was an explosion of popularity of Doctor Who outside of the UK as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think Matt Smith's era was probably pushed more in the US when it started, but that was only because I think the Tenant era had really got a foothold. It had really made an impression and had started getting people talking.
Yeah,
and they just sort of capitalized on that.
I think both they are both the most popular, but they are also both in that unique strata. And it might just be because I'm a bit of a contrarian, admittedly. Whenever I'm talking about Doctor Who, I'm like, yeah, Tom Baker, yeah, David Tennant, they're great, they're wonderful, they have all these little quirks to their performances. But let's talk about these other Doctors instead. Because everybody talks about them much.
Yeah, no, I can sympathize with that. I mean, as I say, I loathe it when people are like all gatekeepery about science fictional franchises and things, because it's there to be enjoyed, and if you're enjoying it in one aspect, then that's fair enough. It's also why I hate it when people say, "Well, this is terrible now," about Doctor Who when it's changed from what they think of as Doctor Who, and I think perhaps more experienced heads sometimes point out that, well, Doctor Who has changed many times, at least superficially, over the years. There's no definitive way. It's just, it's the way that you first experience. I think that's why I have the benefit maybe of being a little bit more objective in that because I came to it in the Wilderness era, there was never any Doctor. There was no my Doctor in that way. I mean, you could argue that McCoy and to some extent Paul McGann with his one story was my Doctor, but I came to Doctor Who and I watched they were all the Doctors. They were all the Doctor in the current, almost like concurrent time streams. It wasn't like this continuity of things. You know, I'd watch a story with Troughton and then I'd put on a story with Colin Baker or something. So they're all kind of equally the Doctor. And I don't get so upset then when a Doctor leaves and a new one joins. I don't find it so difficult to adjust because I'm used to having this kind of multifaceted personality in my mind. But yes, I do
always
agree
energized by it.
Yeah, it's a change, isn't it? You know, there's going to be, they're going to try and do something a little bit different, and as long as they maintain the things that make the show what it is, which they always have done, there's no problem with that, But
I find it interesting. Finish your sentence.
I was just going to say that I agree to some extent, though, that because I love all of Doctor Who, there are parts of it that I think people are missing out on because they fixate on one particular era, one particular Doctor, and that's generally the Tenant era. Is that's and I love that people love that era and love that as much as they do, and it's become such a kind of cultural institution for a lot of people. But at the same time, it kind of makes me a bit. I'm not angry. It's just that I feel like it's such a shame that they hyperfixate on this so that they miss out on some of the other things that can be really great. And Doctor Who is multimedia. There's so many other ways to enjoy it.
As before I let you go, Boingo, just real quick, I do want to amend. Like I don't say like don't talk about them. It's not from a place of anger or like this is bad. It's more like there is more. It's almost in keeping with one of the core messages of the show is there's a lot more to see than just what is around you. You need to broaden your horizons. But go ahead, Boingo.
I was just about to point out that a lot of that kind of sentiment it just feels completely mirrored as like a Marvel Comics fan of just like you see people bitch and moan about certain things and it's just like, what are you talking about? The X-Men have been 1,001 things. It's just this now. Yes, they're on Orgy Island. Get used to it.
You don't understand what a reboot or a multiverse is? I've been dealing with that for decades.
And especially with like the MCU kind of becoming a much bigger thing, and now that the MCU is feeling more like the weirdness of comics, and people are going like it's bad now. It's like no, it's just it's doing the thing that Marvel does.
Boingo, I'm sorry to get into an argument, but there's more of a reason. But that's all I'm saying.
No, a lot of the reasons
the least argument I've ever heard in my life.
A lot of the reasons people give are kind of bullshit.
Oh yeah, a lot of the reasons people give, but like trust me, there's more. The people have. There's some points it just gets drowned out in the cultural bullshit and stuff.
Yeah. There's underlying cultural reasons for these things happens, but the internet talking points don't hit on that, which again can be applied to Doctor Who. We've kind of been dancing around it, I think, because the last time you did like a big vlog thing of directly talking to the audience, Richard, was just before Jodie's era started, and Jodie's era is about to be definitively over now when the new David Tennant episodes come out. And that was a very tumultuous time online for Doctor Who fans, where it almost the discussion of the franchise, at least here in the States, I can't speak to how it was in Britain, but it almost got co-opted into the sort of ever-present right versus left wing. They're trying to make Doctor Who woke by making the Doctor a woman, and that
the word woke was SJW, wasn't it?
Yeah,
And the thing is, if we remove the connotations that get attached to these words by different scenarios, if we just look at their literal definition, I mean, social justice warrior is the definition of the character of the Doctor. Being aware of other cultures and other ways of life and other beliefs is the character of the Doctor. So I think a lot of people, I think, who argue in that way, despite, I mean, I don't want to sound like a hypocrite now because I did just say that people can enjoy it in different ways, but I think that if you fundamentally misunderstand the character of the Doctor that much, then I'm not sure if your arguments are really that convincing, because if you're trying to like you say, co-opt this development into some wider conspiracy theory or whatever, then you're kind of willfully ignoring 55 years of history prior to that point. The Doctor being, I mean, in some ways, some people would argue that the Whittaker era wasn't woke enough. I mean, there's plenty of examples where things were perhaps not handled as well as they could have been, or as liberally as people might want them to be. But I think the argument is it all comes down to whether people believe that there is some agenda-driven movement across all of popular media to forcibly demean masculinity, traditional masculinity in some way, and replace it with whatever buzzword you want to use, Mary Sue characters or something, or you don't believe that. I mean, I think actually the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and I think that the BBC is a company, but it's kind of unusual in that it's a publicly funded company, so its responsibilities financially are to its in some cases unwilling subscribers, because we have to pay a license fee to receive a television signal, whether you want to watch the BBC or not.
There, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, if you've got a television, you've got an aerial or a satellite, you have to pay a TV license. I mean, the government that we have at the moment doesn't entirely agree with that, because they're fairly right wing. They don't really like socialist ideas, so the enforcement of that law as such is not necessarily as stringent as people think it is. But the expectation is you got a television, you have a television license. That's how it began, and that's how the BBC is funded. And the BBC therefore has a set of values which, although they are trying to compete with commercial television, I would argue they go a bit beyond that, because rather than being completely kind of slave to the bottom line, they also have, they were founded on a principle, and you can see this reflected in, like you saying about early Doctor Who, you see it reflected this idea of they were supposed to educate and inform as well as entertain. So that's why you get things like David Attenborough wildlife programs, which are internationally renowned, because it isn't just about making what they think will fit some sort of demographic in a way. It's supposed to appeal to a wide audience and to be good quality. So anyway, all of that exposition is to point out that I think a lot of companies and corporations will, because they think about money and what will appeal, they do want to tick boxes, and they do say, right, we want to make a program that fits this demographic that has X, Y, and Z type of characters in. And that might well be true. That doesn't mean, though, that the creators of the program, the people that are given that brief and then make that program, are as cynical and are not thinking, well, what can we do with this, and what can we say with this, and what opportunities have we got for wider representation? The thing is that the people that moan the loudest about these things are the people who have been represented and are still represented in that media, but they're not used to having anyone else in their minds competing for that representation, so they get a bit worked up about it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's not really a stretch to say that you and I, Richard, are and a lot of the people who come on our podcast, just because of the nature of YouTube, we all tend to be of that similar demographic of white male between 20s and 40s, and having a sort of taste for the more nerdy kind of aspects of pop culture, and it's always very odd to see the other people within that demographic see new stories offered to them, new perspectives offered to them, and go, oh, well, I don't want this because it's taking away my thing. And it's not actually taking away from your thing. Your thing is still right there. If anything, it's adding to the greater conversation that your thing creates. Like I said, I get energized whenever a new Doctor gets announced, and I was especially energized when Jodie got announced because I thought, oh, a female Doctor, that's never been done before. That's an interesting concept. It's going to be interesting to see the kind of stories they can tell from that perspective. And I didn't end up loving the Jodie era, but it was more so because I think in certain cases they sort of failed to capitalize on that opportunity in anything more than sort of trivial mentions here and there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was and I'll talk about this in more detail when I do my eventual video on the era.
Obviously.
So I haven't necessarily fully formed all my arguments about it, but I think it is a very difficult situation because how do you handle some of those things without them being tokenistic or exploitative in some way? And I think Chris Chibnall's approach was basically to basically say the Doctor is the Doctor, the character is the same. There's no necessarily big differences, and the differences that will come out, I think he trusted to the performance of Jodie Whittaker and her as an actress herself. I mean, he was criticised somewhat recently when it came out that the writers that he commissioned for the his first season, Jodie's first season, were not aware, at least initially, that the Doctor was going to be a woman. Even though Chibnall always intended to cast a woman. But I don't think that's necessarily fair criticism, because I think, making television, making films is a collaborative process. And I think that he believed that Whittaker herself would bring aspects to the character, being a woman herself. So I don't think it was necessarily that he was trying to say that there's no differences at all and we shouldn't look into this. But I think you're right that there were opportunities missed. But again, like we talked about context before, I think we've got to look at the wider context of the program. I think the BBC does value Doctor Who. I don't think it necessarily valued it as highly. I think it had got a bit complacent around the end of the Capaldi era and into the Whittaker era. I think Chris Chibnall did quite a good job, really, in trying to raise trying to stamp a bit of a different vision, rather than just sort of picking up the reins and carrying on the same way they had. I mean, even visually, the show looks different. They use different lenses and things like that. It was a bit more international. They went wider. I think his initial approach was, I want a wider representation in the writer's room. And it was originally a more collaborative process than it had been, rather than one person coming up with the broad strokes of all the stories, taking the bulk of the stories to write themselves, and then commissioning other people to sort of write the words. Basically, he cast people who were from a variety of backgrounds and different perspectives, because he trusted that their voices would bring something new to the show. Unfortunately, because of COVID and things like that, there are a lot of things that I don't think were brought to fruition. And I think it's kind of admirable that they kind of pulled off what they did, certainly with the Series 13 and Flux and all that. But I think it's also some of the problems with the show and TV programs in general are reflective of a wider issue than just that program. I think sometimes a lot of people, when they criticize Doctor Who, or Doctor Who fans, this is when they very much look at it and compare it to itself and its past, and they forget about some of the wider contexts. I mean, television is undergoing a real change. I mean, entertainment in general is, films and television, the rise of streaming, and institutions like the BBC as a publicly funded thing. The clock is ticking, basically. I mean, I'm pretty sure that in the next 20 years or so, the BBC will end up as a subscription service. That'll probably only be streaming, and therefore, arguably, it won't exist as what it is anymore. It won't be this thing that's a kind of like at the heart of British culture. Some would argue that it isn't that at all now anyway, but it certainly won't be when it goes. And I think They wanted it to continue. They wanted it to be, but they didn't really always have the money or the kind of political support in some way to keep these programs going. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into soaps, things like EastEnders and things like that, but they are relatively cheap and straightforward. And doing something like Doctor Who has always been a real stretch for a company that, you know, is essentially not profiting from it, because all of the merchandise or anything that is sold for Doctor Who, any money that is made, doesn't go back into Doctor Who. It goes back into the BBC as a company. It's not allowed to go to the program. The BBC is not allowed to profit in that way. So you can say, well, this show is watched all around the world. It has this big fan base, but that makes the BBC a lot of money. It doesn't necessarily make the program lots of money.
Yeah,
and that's why I think this deal with Disney Plus, this kind of co-production, is a real sign of where things are going.
It's very interesting because, you know, it's often talked about with these big franchises about like, oh, it's making so much money, so it should look so much better. But it really is a thing of like, well, certain people still have to get paid for their work on this thing. Certain people in different sectors that you don't even think would be working on this have to get paid. Certainly to have it delivered to you, it has to be paid for. And there's also the factor of like Doctor Who has all kinds of merchandising behind it, and that's certainly a big money maker for the BBC. You know, over here in the American fandom, we often like to say like, oh yeah, Doctor Who these days it was a throwaway program for them back in the day, but now it's like their cash cow, and it really even isn't, because it's such a different way things work for you guys over there.
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, it is a prestige. The BBC recognise, and they didn't for a very long time. Although they did make, as I say, they made money. Money was coming in to the BBC even in the wilderness years. All the books and things like that, and the license things, DVD sales, all that kind of thing was coming back into the BBC. They were happy to take that money, but the people at the time were not particularly proud of it. And this kind of cultural institution that it had been, you know, at one time everyone watched Doctor Who pretty much. You know, I mean, I know in America viewing figures are very much greater because there's so many more people, but you know, there were episodes of Doctor Who in the 70s that got, you know, almost 20 million viewers, which is insane, you know. I mean,
these days, like mainstream sporting events struggle to get those kind of numbers.
Yeah, because they're so. I mean, you again talking about context, you got to factor in the fact there were only 3 television channels in UK in those days, and one of them was on strike a lot, so there wouldn't be anything on. So, you know, that helped it out a little bit. But you know, people were watching it. Everyone was talking about the playground, all those kinds of things. I didn't experience that so much, but you know, even when I was at school, you know, in the mid to late 90s, everyone I went to school with, they knew what Doctor Who was, even though it hadn't been on in 10 years.
Yeah,
really.
Because there was a much more homogenous culture in those days. These days, you know, stuffing can seem like the biggest thing in the world to you, and then you can walk into a store and meet somebody who's never even heard of it before.
Well, I think that's also, I mean, that's one of the, I don't know, danger's the right word of streaming services, is that there are these fantastic, I mean, I get sport for choice. I mean, a lot of the time I'm busy doing things for my channel. I don't watch as many things as I used to, but there, you know, there's so many shows now. In back in the day, you know, I'd say, right, The Sopranos, I'll watch all of The Sopranos or something. But now there's like 15 different options, all prestige, all really high quality programs. And the other thing is you watch them and then they're kind of gone, you know? I mean, in some cases they literally go, like where they delete them off streaming, you can't get them on physical media, but they just sort of disappear, don't they?
Yeah, because they keep putting stuff out and it gets buried in these menus, and that's just in the streaming services you pay for. I feel sometimes like a bit of an ass because I watch so much YouTube, and there will be weeks where I'll be like, I only watched 2 episodes of actual TV. What is going on anymore?
Well, I mean, I watch a lot of YouTube. and to be fair, that's because a lot of stuff on YouTube is more because it doesn't necessarily have to appeal to such a massive demographic in order to justify its budget or whatever. You can find things that are far more niche and appeal to you as an individual. But I mean, I don't have we're subscribed to some streaming services, but we don't have like cable or anything. We have a satellite dish, and we have a free. I don't know what the situation is in America, but in England we have this thing called Freeview or FreeSat. So it's like it's a box that you can watch television programs that are kind of free to air as long as you've got your TV license. So you can watch the BBC and things like that. But my box actually broke last year. And I haven't replaced it yet, so I literally can't watch television. I need to get a new one before the new Doctor Who starts. It's a shame, really, because it had a hard drive in it that records shows, and I was actually on a quiz show a couple of years ago, and it had my recording on there, and I can't get it off now because I think it's like encoded specially to this thing.
Oh damn! Maybe you could see if somebody's put it on YouTube or something.
Yeah. I need to look it up, but.
I was just gonna say, as far as TV goes, the BBC is a lot like PBS over here, which is public broadcasting system essentially. That's where like Sesame Street and stuff like that would be on.
Well, it used to be. Now Sesame Street's on HBO.
Well, yeah, now, but essentially you can, if you could buy an antenna, any kind of like receiver or anything like that, and like these could be like $5-6 at like Walmart, $20 maybe. You can pick up usually news, some other types of public broadcasting and other types of free channels, and there'll be a couple of them that are just always available depending on where you're pointing your actual receiver.
And of course, that was the home in the 70s and 80s of Doctor Who, was the PBS channels. But of course, the problem when it comes from a production point of view, if you're is that they rely on donations, don't they, on pledge drives and things like that, because the BBC, you have to pay the BBC. They get their money to put into their programs, and a lot of people, I really value the BBC as an institution, but a lot of people in this country are getting more and more resentful at having to pay a license fee, especially when they don't necessarily agree with what they think the BBC is. The thing is, the BBC, because it's trying to kind of appeal to everyone, it ends up not appealing to, upsetting a lot of people. There's a load of people in this country absolutely convinced that the BBC is really left-wing and liberal and woke and all this and needs to be got rid of. And then there's an equal group of people that think it's right-wing and doing whatever the politicians tell them to. So you can't really win,
It is.
That's a pretty funny situation.
Well, it also, it does not help that it's undermined by the press quite a lot in this country, because that press, is owned by companies like News International, who have their own interest in getting rid of the BBC so that they can monopolize the television. So, anyway, these sort of larger things, they do have an impact. They've had an impact on the BBC, and you will see things like not only recessions and things like that affecting the seasons of the show, but like where the episodes there's fewer episodes per season because the BBC can't afford to make as many as they did before. There's less scope to it, and that's why I think it was going to happen. I don't think it was necessarily because of the Whittaker era, though arguably it wasn't as well, no, it's not arguably, it's factual. It wasn't as popular for a wider audience as previous eras, but that's not necessarily because of the Whittaker era. I think that's partly to do with the trend. The show has been back now for going on 20 years, and if you think of any other science fiction show that's been going for that long, that's a good innings, and of course Doctor Who has the benefit that it can reinvent itself to some extent every few years, but it's still going to be somewhat tired for a general audience. When Doctor Who came back in this country, there were very few, if any, sort of homegrown science fiction programs, because after the 80s and the early 90s, a lot of British production companies had just given up on trying to make science fiction. It was too dangerous to do it in the sense of it cost a lot of money, and it quite often didn't work, and it couldn't compete with things like Star Trek or Babylon 5 even, or something like that. And so a lot of them just sort of said, now let's just make costume dramas, period dramas, Pride and Prejudice, and they did those beautifully and brilliantly, but there's this big gap where just no one wanted to take any risks, and it needed someone like Russell T Davies to come in and say, no, let's do it. And they did Doctor Who, and one of the reasons why it was so popular was because not only because he wrote it in a way and produced it in a way to appeal to more than just the stereotypical fan of science fiction, but also it was partly, I would imagine, somewhat why the appeal is for the program to some extent overseas, is because it's unusually British. Most science fiction, at least until recently, has been kind of monopolized by a kind of American style. And so people sometimes find it just interesting to watch something different and have different kind of voices and ideas.
That's why a large part of our channel is dedicated to interest in essentially Japanese science fiction programs. It's more than that, but it does have this element of, it's not what everyone else is watching. It's in a totally different language with different sort of expectations towards behavior and whatnot that makes it sort of fun to watch as a difference for everything else. And I won't deny that probably was part of the initial appeal of Doctor Who to me, but mostly it really is just good character writing, and the fact that the Doctor himself is such a immediately endearing character, even in incarnations like we talked about earlier with Eccleston and Hartnell, where they're a little more closed off. You can see there is good in this person, and you want it to come out.
Yeah. I think that's the thing that makes Russell T Davies such a successful writer generally, is that he is a really good writer of character. He understands people just really, really well, and he reflects that in the characters that he creates. I would argue that someone like Stephen Moffat, who helmed the show for Matt Smith and Capaldi's eras, is probably a better ideas person. I kind of appreciate the kind of science fiction ideas in a lot of his stories. I think they're a little bit more ingenious than the Davies ideas. But I can't deny that Davies is a fantastic writer of character, and I think that's the thing, that everyone who enjoys any of the programs he's done, the things that really stay with them, not so much visuals or anything like that, they're moments of character, the character moments. And I think that's one of the reasons why people get so invested in that. But I also recognize, I think Russell T Davies is a very, very clever writer, and he's someone who he wrote a book. Well, it was more of a collection of email correspondence that he had with a journalist who worked for Doctor Who magazine, and he had this sort of, it started off as just kind of an informal sort of interview, and then it became like this whole correspondence where he almost kind of just regurgitated all his process of writing, and it was while he was writing season 4 of the Davies era, so the era that Donna was in, and what I found really fascinating about that is because he comes across as someone who's so confident and so assured as a writer, but when you read this, you see how reflective and how he really beats himself up about things, and what that made me realize is that this is someone who doesn't just settle. He's someone who's going to keep developing, and so I'm really excited to see what he's going to do, not just visually but with the narrative, with the characters. I don't think a lot of people, when it was first announced that he would be coming back as the lead showrunner, were sort of go, right, we'll go back to what it was, back when it was good, quote unquote. And then there were other people that said, oh no, I want something new. And I think that he is going to give us something new. I think that he's someone who is reflecting on things, and I've got a sneaking suspicion. I have nothing to really base this on, but of course these anniversary specials that are coming up are going to have David Tennant in, and of course the big mystery is how has the Doctor in a way regenerated back into an earlier incarnation, because it is said he is the 14th Doctor. He's not backward regenerated into the 10th. It is the same body. And why is Donna and all that coming back? And I think it's Russell T Davies having his cake and eating it in a way, because I hope in a way, I think what would be really interesting, because the villain has now been confirmed as this celestial toy maker who played by Neil Patrick Harris, who was in a William Hartnell story many, many years ago. But essentially he's kind of like a godlike being who has almighty powers over reality. And I think that I kind of hope there's going to be a bit of a meta commentary on the fact that I think that he is the one who has caused him to end up looking like Tenant again. And it's almost like he's forcing him to be the way he wants him to be with Donna, almost like a very proprietorial fan who's kind of like, let's put it back the way it was when it was good. And I hope in a way there's going to be a bit of a commentary on that, where at the end he's sort of saying, no, I need to go forward into the future, and that's when he's going to become the Ncuti Gatwa incarnation of the Doctor that we're all looking forward to.
That could be very interesting. I hadn't guessed at that at all, but I
think it's something I think that Davis might do. There's a kind of clever thing that he has.
It is very meta commentary kind of like thing. Yeah, totally would make sense. Jesus.
And that's it's a much more popular form and commonly expected form of storytelling now than it was back during Davis's original run.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, they're aware. I mean, it's quite clear that they're going to expand. They're going to take this opportunity. This is the beginning, in a way. They're going to create the Hooniverse, as they call it, where there's going to be spin-off shows and things like that. That there was to some extent that was there before with Torchwood and Sarah Jane Adventures, and they kind of fed off each other and fed back into the main show. But there's grander plans at work, and I think that Doctor Who has always been both innovative and reactive. It has borrowed things from existent media. It's taken what's worked. Star Wars came out, and suddenly you've got kind of a lot more science fiction-y stories with evil empires and overthrowing. In Star Trek, you had transmats instead of transporters, and all. You had a federation. They've always borrowed things from existent IP, and I think that the multiversal nature of things like the MCU, I think, will have to some extent an influence on this. But I think the great thing about Doctor Who is it also provides some opportunity, because it doesn't take itself too seriously, and it shouldn't take itself too seriously. I think it provides a bit of an opportunity to perhaps comment on that as well. I think that Davis is clever enough to do something like that. I mean, to some extent, Chibnall was as well. I think a lot of people, I don't know if you guys saw the finale of the Whittaker era, but a big aspect of that story was the Master wanting to be the Doctor. And essentially stealing her form, looking like him, but stealing her body. And then what does he do? He garbs himself in aspects of every incarnation of the Doctor. He's got the question mark pullover that Sylvester McCoy had. He has the scarf on. He has the trousers from Patrick Troughton. I think a lot of people didn't get that. In some ways, that I think that was Chibnall kind of saying, he's like the uber fan here, who says, I don't want you, Jodie Whittaker. I'm going to be the Doctor, and I'm going to be what I think makes the Doctor Who Doctor, the Doctor Who, yeah, and have sort of force his idea of what the character should be in the show on it. I think some people kind of miss that. I think I'm right in saying that there's a bit of a commentary on the proprietorial fans.
Oh, definitely. I really enjoyed that whole episode, where it was very much Chibnall sort of having his cake and eating it too, of like, okay, I'm doing a finale for my era. I'm giving a slight middle finger to the fans who have been rude to me all these years. And I'm also celebrating the show's history as much as I possibly can.
I think it was. I mean, I mean, in the moment, it was incredibly enjoyable. I loved it, and I loved all the fan servicey moments. I think, after the party, after the hangover, you can kind of look back and go, well, maybe they overdid it a bit here and stuff. But I really did enjoy it, and I liked also the fact that there was a bit of love for the 80s era of Doctor Who.
Bringing back those companions, which
Yeah.
I've been asking for, and by asking, I mean, I've just been going in my head, oh man, it would be great if they brought back Sophie Aldred for years, because Ace is definitely my favorite classic companion. And I should say I did really enjoy your recent video about her specifically.
Thank you. Yeah, that was that took a while to. Sometimes these videos, when I sit down to write, I just get these very difficult, kind of almost like writer's block kind of things, and I'm not quite sure why for that one, but I think it's because, like you, Ace is one of my all-time favorite companions. She was the companion that I was first aware of, because that was the era of the show that I vaguely remember from actually being on the television. And she's such a sign of things to come. That's why I was saying earlier about checking out McCoy. If you want to check out the classic era, and you find the pace of the old era is a bit slow, you check out the McCoy era, because it is very much a template for what would go on to be. You've got very similar, and you've got similarities with the character of Ace and Rose to some extent as well. Not just the fact that they're both from kind of London council estates, but from the fact that they're both characters that develop and change over their time with the Doctor, which might seem quite an obvious thing for a character to do in a drama these days, but in classic Doctor Who, that's actually quite rare, for numerous reasons. But one of them was because science fiction drama wasn't approached always with that sense of needing to develop the character like a real human being. It's a little bit like classic Star Trek. I mean, although there's a history to these characters, it's almost like the status quo is restored at the end of every episode.
It's about the situation rather than the overall story. And I think another thing about Ace that makes her so fascinating is she is the first attempt at a companion who comes from sort of common means, but has a magic destiny about her, and they never even got to realize that with her, which is part of what I think for myself and so many others makes her an intriguing character, is just the what could have been aspect.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and in a way, although it was unfortunate that we didn't get to see that ending, the fact that it wasn't brought to fruition means that we've had so many, as I've said in the video, there's so many alternative futures that she's had, so you can kind of pick your destiny for Ace now.
Yeah, and the show one, like, again, just getting back to a little discussion of the power of the Doctor, the one they did in that episode was even kind of satisfying, I thought, because it felt so almost heartbreakingly realistic of like, at one point in your childhood you had this thing going for you and you could have gone in this direction and done these great things, but something happened and you've just kind of been doing other things ever since.
Yeah, I think they took that idea. This is something that was kind of implied in the classic era to some extent. I mean, most companions, once they left, you never really heard of them again. There's one or two exceptions. Jo Grant was mentioned later, the following year after she had departed with the Third Doctor. Sarah Jane is kind of a unique case because she was actually given a spin-off series, at least a pilot episode, which, if you see nothing else, watch the opening sequence, like the opening credits to K9 and Company on YouTube.
I've actually watched that whole first episode.
Yeah.
That is rough. Like, you want to talk about old British television being rough.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's such a fantastic example of British television trying to do the kind of exciting, how a lot of American sci-fi shows at the time, they had a house style to some extent, where you would have the character, look at the camera and then their name would come up on the screen, that kind of thing. You had it in like Battlestar Galactica, the original Battlestar Galactica, things like
Power
that.
Rangers
the
also
A-Team and
did it.
stuff. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's like that, but they just don't have much to do. So it's Sarah Jane running down a country lane and then driving in a very 80s English car. It was not really English, but typically seen in England. And then just these canine on a dry stone wall that you get in Yorkshire. It's and just the most terrible theme tune.
The theme tune genuinely sounds like a YouTube poop of the 80s Doctor Who soundtrack.
Did someone say YouTube poops?
I did. We woke Buster.
You could probably use it.
I've been listening. I just haven't had things to say.
Yeah.
But no, you should check it out. But as I say, she was unusual in the fact that she had this. So there was an established canon spin-off storyline for her, and so with both of those characters, you got a more explicit sense that their time with the Doctor had affected them, and that they had gone on to develop and become I don't know, warriors for goodness. This is something that Russell T Davies very much kind of underlined and spelled out when he brought her back, Sarah Jane, and then in the Sarah Jane adventures, sort of mentioned other companions and how they'd all gone on to do things and experience, because of their time with the Doctor, the impact that they had on them.
Yeah, the sort of modern mytholization of him that happens in the Davies and to a lesser extent the Moffat era of he is this almost cosmic force for good that changes everything he comes into contact with, which I sort of have a love-hate relationship with it, because
I do too as well. I'd agree, because in one way it kind of takes away the I don't know. In some respect, I mean, I once did. Someone asked me, I did this survey thing, and it was about Doctor Who, and they said it was about the companions of Doctor Who, and they said, which companions do you relate to? And that is the purpose of the companion as their function in the show. They are the audience identification figure, and we learn about the Doctor through them. That's quite a common thread. But growing up, I always tended to identify more with the Doctor to some extent. Not that I thought I was somehow some cosmic force for good or a genius or anything, but just I think I appreciated, and this is something I said in my very early video, the very first one I did as a sort of introduction. I mentioned about how one of the reasons why Doctor Who is so important to me is that although he's a fictional character, it very much influenced me as I was growing up. You look to even fictional role models, in a time when most masculine male heroes were kind of your Arnold Schwarzeneggers and your Stallone, and kind of, you punch your problems away. I had a character who not only valued learning, but kind of almost evangelized about it, and also fought evil, but used violence really as a last resort. And that was part of the reason why I said in that video that I felt that the gender of the character that was quite important. But I regret that I didn't really make it clear what I meant in that original video, because at that time they hadn't cast a female Doctor. So I didn't really anticipate it being misconstrued in some way, because some people say that I therefore think that a female Doctor can't work, and that wasn't quite what I was saying. What I was saying was that to me, when I was growing up, the fact that it was a male hero character was quite important to me, because at that time, I'm ashamed to say, I probably wouldn't have been as influenced by a female lead character. But now, one of the things that I've really enjoyed seeing since Jodie Whittaker has become the Doctor has not only been the impact on young girls who see, well, I don't have to be the sidekick anymore, I get to be the lead, and all those fantastic aspects of the character that influence me, or also influence them. But also, and I think in some way I take a lot of joy and hope out of this, the amount of young boys who watch Jodie Whittaker and see her as the Doctor and see her in the same way that I did the Doctor when I was growing up, which just goes to show that those kind of gender archetypes are not as, despite what some people might want to argue, they're not quite as firm or as delineated as they once were. So, the Doctor can be anyone, really.
And as much as like we might not be comfortable with that method of approaching the character, it almost kind of proves Chibnall's idea true of the Doctor is the Doctor. There's certain universal truths that hit in whether they are presenting as a man or a woman.
Yeah.
And that is something that I think indelibly makes that whole era valuable, despite what you might feel about certain aspects of the story or the production or the scripting or the effects or anything like that. As much as like I'm like, well, I didn't enjoy Doctor Who as much during this last era as I usually do. I would never say like, oh, it's outright bad or it doesn't matter, because there were episodes in there I really enjoyed. There were moments in there I really enjoyed, and certainly I didn't get the chance to say this earlier because we were kind of focusing on production and perceptions, but I think Jodie's performance was fantastic for the majority of episodes.
Yeah, I don't think they've really gone wrong with the casting of the Doctor ever, really. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I think that each actor has brought something different to the role and has built on their predecessors and has made their era somewhat unique. And I think that's the sign of good casting, that it isn't just the writing of the character, it's the casting of the actor and what they bring to it that makes it successful. There are aspects that, I mean, people say to me, who's your favorite Doctor? That's a common question. And I don't really have one. And the reason for that is partly because, as I say, I came to Doctor Who when there were several people as the Doctor. They were all the Doctor at the same time to me. But I do have a type of Doctor that I prefer, and that tends to be the more alien, the more eccentric version of the Doctor. Probably the slightly more awkward one, and I don't know what that says about me. But people like Matt Smith and Tom Baker, Patrick Troughton, those kinds of incarnations, and then you get kind of more human incarnations like Peter Davison, David Tennant, Jodie Whittaker. That I don't necessarily like that interpretation of the character as much. But it's all part of that. It's all facets, really, of the role of the character. And just like anything, the thing about the show is that it develops, it changes, and if there's an aspect that you don't particularly enjoy about it, just the nature of the show means that it will change, it will evolve, and then maybe you'll get something that you prefer. I don't like it when people read things into things. They say, well, they're doing this with Russell T Davies to save the show, that Chibnall ruined it in some ways. I mean, yeah, I'm sure that this new version will be, it will have a bit of a bang, at least to begin with, just because of the way it's been marketed, the decisions that Russell T Davies is making. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's like a course correction or something like that. It's just another evolution in the show. It's another aspect to it. I watched Doctor Who when I loved Doctor Who. No one I knew watched it. It wasn't loved by anyone. So I'm used to enjoying it without this kind of sense that it's popular. It was very much unpopular. So as long as, just purely selfishly, as long as I enjoy it, I don't really care what the mass majority. The only reason why I care is because I want them to keep making it.
Yeah, very much so. I think a lot of people can agree with that when it comes to their own favorite franchises or what have you, because it at the end of the day, it really is about just enjoying things on your own terms, making the content that we do. You tend to get caught up in the idea of like, oh, well, they're doing this to please this demographic, or they're doing that to please that demographic, and this is good, but this is bad. And at the end of the day, there is no outright good, bad delineation. It's all about personal preference. I'm somebody who very vehemently believes objectively good does not exist. It's all a matter of opinion.
And objectively bad by converse.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that's bandied about quite a lot on online discourse. I think what it is, I mean, I don't know if I'm just a really sentimental person, but, we could take a similar kind of analysis towards something like Star Wars, with the sequel trilogy and the way that the way that the social media discourse has kind of reacted to that. But I'm a big Star Wars fan as well. And, I grew up with the original trilogy, and that is my preferred favorite. Of course it is, because when I encountered it, I was a young child who wasn't cynical in thinking about this and that. I just enjoyed it for what it was.
Yeah, it matters
and
what you
because
see when
it's
you're at an impressionable age.
exactly. And then I was fortunate enough to go to Galaxy's Edge earlier this year in Florida, and there's little kids dressed up as Rey running around with their lightsabers, and there's people that want to go in and go. I don't know if you've ever seen that episode of Spaced with or a clip from it with Simon Pegg. But before he got big in America, he had this sort of sitcom show where he works.
I mean, it was worked with Edgar Wright too, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That was what they worked on, and Nick Frost was in it as well.
And then they did the Cornetto trilogy.
That's right. Yeah. So there's a scene you probably find it on YouTube where an episode begins, and Simon Pegg's character's got a job in a comic book store, and episode 1 has just come out, and he's just screaming into the camera, just going, "You weren't there at the beginning. You don't know what it's like." Say you just how dare you like this trumped up toy commercial, and then it cuts and it's just a little kid who wanted to buy a Jar Jar Binks figure, and it's like it's a great example of how we as adults and people, we care a lot about these things. Of course we do, and we care about what we perceive as genuine and all that kind of thing. But in some ways, Star Wars was always a toy commercial, but it was also something deeper than that, and that resonated. And you can find that in Jar Jar Binks, and you can find that in Rey just as much as we did with Han Solo.
It's interesting. I can't remember where I saw this, but years ago I saw somebody say, when everything that came before you is indelible and enshrined and is what it is because it's always been there from your perspective, and everything that comes out when you're young is fun and new and exciting, maybe not the best, but at least interesting and something you'll look back on fondly because you're experiencing it from the first time when you're at the age of having the most active mind you can.
Yeah.
And everything past a certain point in your adulthood is a bit hard to accept because it's very much not that. It's not for you. It's this new thing that's coming in after your time has come and gone, and it's hard to accept that.
I know, yeah. And but one of the things I think is I'm quite fortunate, and I don't think it's necessarily something I've consciously done or something. It's just something I'm lucky enough to have. And Charlie Brooker, the television commentator, the guy who wrote Black Mirror, when he used to comment on television, he used to have a program called Screen Wipe, and one episode he talked about Doctor Who, and he said that in some way when he watches Doctor Who, because he was hilariously critical about things when he watched stuff on the show, but he said with Doctor Who something just bypasses the adult part of my mind and just taps into my inner 10-year-old. And I'm like that as well with Doctor Who. Like I can see it in two minds. I can evaluate it. And in some ways, I do what I'm advising not to do. My videos are kind of they're over intellectualized analyses of something that really the thing that I can't capture and can't express, and no matter how many words I write, is just the unadulterated joy of sitting down and being like a kid again. I mean, the other night I almost posted this. It was my wife and I are teachers, and my wife was at an open evening, which I didn't have to be at the school. So I had an evening essentially to myself, and I went home and I thought, I won't make dinner because I can't be bothered to make dinner for myself. So I sat down and I had beans on toast, which is a very traditional English thing, tin of beans that you heat up in the microwave and bung on some toast. And I sat down and watched episode 1 of The Hand of Fear with Tom Baker. And although I wasn't alive in 1976 or whenever it came out, I felt like I was transported back to that moment, and it was just me watching Doctor Who. And that's the joy of it. It isn't the big analysis and discourse. It's just that fun adventure,
Yeah, it's.
I think that's what we're all searching sometimes with our entertainment, with our fantasy. We just want that kind of comfort in some way.
You just want something that's fun, life affirming, and gives you something you can't get in your average life. I think that's a big part of what makes Doctor Who and fiction in general appealing. Like, I can't necessarily say I have that with Doctor Who, but I certainly have that with other franchises I like that I've been with for longer. We haven't talked about it at all in this call, but I'm a rather big Transformers fan, and I spent most of this week doing my day job thing and working on a new video for the channel, and I got it out and done on Friday morning, and Friday evening I got a package with a bunch of new Transformers figures delivered, and I was like, well, I was going to start on this next thing tonight, but you know what? Let's just take a night. Let's just open these figures and have some fun.
Yeah, it's the thing. Like, I had to put a video during COVID. I was a bit bored, and I thought, I didn't have time to make a big video, but I thought I'll do a little video, and I did this little collection video, self-indulgent collection video where I showed all my Doctor Who figures and bits and bobs that I've collected over the years,
which was super exciting for me because that stuff's really hard to get over here.
Yeah, I know. Well, you see, this is the thing: is when I was growing up, there was a company in Wales, a little company that made railway sets and things like that. And for some reason, they got the license to make Doctor Who figures. And around about the 30th anniversary, so 1993, a load of them were stocked across the country. And I went to London. I happened to go to London, and I went to Hamleys, which is a big sort of traditional Victorian big toy store. And my dad said I could have something from there, and I found it was a Starship Enterprise from Next Generation. I got that, and I thought it had sounds and all that, and I thought this is great. And then I went up a floor, and I saw all these Doctor Who figures, and there were Daleks and TARDISes and all that, and I thought, oh, that's great, but I really want this Enterprise figure, because of course at that time I thought, well, if they're in the shops now, they'll be in the shops again. They'll be here next year. So I got the Enterprise and then went home, and then for the whole year, because it was my 10th birthday the following year, I said, I'll go back to Hamleys for my 10th birthday, and I'll get all these Doctor Who figures. And in my mind, I thought, well, they must have made all the figures, all the Doctors, because that's what Star Wars does. They make everything. So I was intending, to get all the figures, and I got there. And I was lucky enough to get a TARDIS and a Sylvester McCoy figure and a Bonnie Langford figure randomly, but that was it. And I was so disappointed. Like, I never got these figures, and then the company went out of business and all this kind of thing, and you could never do it. So when it came along that the show got popular again, and they started doing figures for the new show, and then they did all the classic era, I thought, well, this is the time to fulfill my childhood dream kind of thing. So it's a little bit like what we were saying about, sort of transporting yourself back to childhood. I spent a ridiculous amount of money on all these bits of molded plastic, just to satisfy that itch that I'd had since I was 10 years old,
Yeah, very much so. That's
And some people say, some miserable, cynical people like to go on about, the modern people were infantilized and all this kind of thing. But like the Doctor says, there's no point being grown up if you can't be childish sometimes.
Very much so. That's something we talk about on this channel pretty regularly, because we're actually either very big toy collectors or want to be very big toy collectors. The three of us that are still in the call, Buster had to take off, so everybody go check out Buster's stuff if you haven't already. Links are in the description. Yeah, love you, Buster. But typically, I see those arguments from people who are like, oh, it's not even my generation, because like I'm in my mid-20s. I grew up in the early 2000s, late 90s, and so I see a lot of people who are older than me, sort of around your age group, even Richard, in the States, who say, oh, our generation, we just can't let our toys go. And what's happened where everything is constantly coming back and being remade. And I think what has happened is that culturally, with the world becoming more and more connected as it has since that generation, people have become much more understanding of having an interest in things that might be a little simpler, a little more childish, a little more fun as you get older, in order to make the rigors of adult life a bit more palatable.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. We're realizing in some ways that, we don't have to be. I think people are a little bit more honest with themselves sometimes. That they, this idea of I put aside childish things, when I became a man. And I think
I was
maybe
about to
my
bring
generation,
up the C.S. Lewis quote.
would say, well, no, why should I? I like it. Why not? I felt that for a long time. I mean, I'm the generation, certainly in this country, where, like I was saying earlier, if you were a fan of science fiction, fantasy things, you were almost kind of encouraged to be ashamed of that. And I come from a more rural part of England, not in a big city or anything like that. So there weren't the kind of communities and fan groups that maybe other people enjoyed. And to be honest, I'm not sure when I was younger whether I would have been comfortable being part of that anyway. I'm a bit more solitary, but this idea of you can't admit that you like these things, almost like you were kind of repressed in some way. And I think it came a point where I just thought, sod it, I like it, I don't care. And I was just sort of more honest a little bit. I mean, I'm not very extrovert, other than having a YouTube channel I'm not very extrovert about me. I don't like cosplay and things like that, but I admire people who do have that confidence to do that and to share that and to be received warmly by other people.
Well, I mean, like you're not even that active on social media except for like basic promotion of your videos.
I'm very much a lurker.
And I've sort of had to in the last year mentally, because I used to be that way, and then when I started making videos, I was very much of like, no, if you're going to be making content about a fandom, you have to be active in that fandom, and the people have to know who you are so they know you do this and they'll want to come and see it. And I've just gotten burned so much over so many years that over the last year I've kind of increasingly become more and more of like, no, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on social media or even watching other people's content. I find myself sort of coming to the back end of my 20s going, I want to spend less time discussing these things and more time just engaging with them on my own level.
Yeah. And I think that's partly why I don't tend to react to news about Doctor Who, because it takes away some of the enjoyment for me as a viewer. I have no, not to disparage anyone who does do that, but I see what I offer anyway on my channel is more of a kind of a retrospective. So I don't tend to talk about current aspects so much. I would like to wait a few years because a lot of what I want to talk about, you don't learn about until the dust has settled. And
I mean, you're not even close to caught up to current in your main series.
No.
And I think that affords you a bit more perspective than a lot of people tend to have in their content, where they'll either be doing current and going back from the beginning simultaneously, or they'll be jumping all around, and they'll always feel a need to jump on the news. And it creates this sort of reactionary culture of like, just, it doesn't so matter how you feel about the thing, it matters that you feel about the thing before anybody else can.
And I appreciate, I think, sometimes people want to know how I feel about something that's come along, and I don't mind talking about it at all. But I don't feel that need. I think also it's because I've never approached doing YouTube and things like that with the same fervor I think that some people might have. They'll watch things on YouTube to learn how to make YouTube videos, and what that tends to result in is a lot of very samey content. Everyone starts the video with like, "What's up, guys? Like and subscribe," and all that business.
Well, you're also afforded the privilege of you have a day job, a career you're very secure in, and a life outside of this. Whereas a lot of people these days tend to come to it from I want this to be my job. I want to be able to go. I want to be able to go to a party and say I'm a professional YouTuber.
Yeah, and believe me, I would too. There's some days where my job is an inconvenience. I'd get a lot of. I mean, being a teacher, that's a vocation rather than a job. I don't just work to live, but it is something that interferes a lot of the time with creating projects and things like that. It provides me with a lot of interesting perspectives, which I think actually then can inform my outlook on things. Certainly when it comes to young people and the way they respond to media and think of representation and stuff like that. But it does interfere, I suppose, sometimes with me being a bit more regular. But at the same time, also, I think that I've always kind of been a bit more sort of, you build it and they will come kind of attitude towards it, of thinking that I think it's because when I was younger, when I was a teenager, I wanted to be an actor, sort of. And my girlfriend at the time, who was very realistic, she said, well, look, it's not really going to happen. The chances of it happening are so infinitesimal. But she wasn't necessarily saying that to kind of put me off, but just she had a very realistic viewpoint, and that kind of adjusted my expectations perhaps a little bit. So similarly, when I went into YouTube, I didn't necessarily think, right, I'm going to do this video, I'm going to get a gazillion views and 10,000 subscribers. I just kind of saw it as a fun project, really, and I thought, well, maybe people will like it. I mean, it helps that obviously I'm talking about a franchise which is very, very popular, and it's no coincidence that when I did my Tom Baker video, that was when I started getting quite a lot of subscribers, and it's just kind of snowballed since then. So it's not just me, and it's not just my content that's drawing people in. It's going to be the subject matter. I think the real test will be when I eventually do something different, if that ever happens. But
I think it is the fact that you put in the efforts to research these things, to get all the proper sources, to script it out in a manner that weaves a narrative for each era, and that you perform it in a way and provide these personal anecdotes here and there that keeps people engaged that makes your content worth watching. It's worth checking out because it's Doctor Who, but it's worth watching in full because it's Richard D. Carrier's perspective on Doctor Who. I don't watch a lot of Doctor Who channels because a lot of Doctor Who content tends to be very minimally just let's review this episode, or let's review this new release, or this news, or this piece of merchandise that's come out, and is it good or bad, moving on. Whereas you take a wholly different perspective of, well, this is the facts and the wider context this show fits within, and this is what makes these particular eras appealing or issue rodden in their own right.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, that's part of why I did it. Really, was to appeal to people, maybe outside of the fandom. Say, why, what is this? What's the big deal, kind of thing, And I've been quite flattered that I've had a few people that have said, "Well, I don't really watch Doctor Who, but I like your videos." So I mean, that's always quite complimentary. Yeah, and it has kind of grown over the years. I'd say that the ones that I obviously, as I've become more, I've got more subscribers, so I feel in some way more of an obligation to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, perhaps more than I did when I first began. But also I've been able to, people have been very generous patrons that I've been able to invest in better equipment and can produce better results. And it is a hobby at the end of the day. I would like it to be more I'd like to devote more time to it, but I'm not really under any illusions of how much money I could make out of it. I'm not trying to necessarily chase money as such, but obviously it's very nice that if someone's appreciated what I've done, that if they want to donate towards me producing more content, then that's always nice,
Oh yeah. If I've said it many times, if I had a Patreon that matched my income from my day job, I'd quit my day job tomorrow, but that's years off at best.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've been going for almost 2.5 hours, so I think
sorry
this
about
is
that. I have that effect. I'm an awful waffler.
Oh,
You can tell them from my videos.
It's been an interesting conversation, and I think listening to your perspective on things has been a welcome change of pace from the usual sort of monotony of us just going, this is what's going on in my life. This is why being a YouTuber with a day job's a pain in the ass this week. But
Yeah.
and I think anybody who came here because they like your content probably will have enjoyed getting to hear your perspective on things in a different format. So folks, if you are new to the channel, if you came here just for Richard, please consider sticking around, like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, all that good stuff. We have a various social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter at The Modular Media, on Bluesky at modularmedia.bsky.social, on Tumblr at Modular Media. But before we go, Richard, do you want to go ahead and plug your content for anybody listening to this who might not have been familiar with you and is now going like, oh, this guy is really interesting and knows what he's talking about. I want to go check that out.
Sure, yeah. Well, the main place you're going to find my stuff is on YouTube. Clever Dick Films is the name of the channel, which I don't actually like being called Dick, even though it is short for Richard. I didn't realize that a lot of people in the world didn't know that, and they think I'm being rude or something. But I needed to come up with some name for the channel that would be catchy, so it's called Clever Dick Films, and I'm also on Twitter and on Facebook, and I also have a Patreon. Which if you haven't fallen asleep, or maybe you have, listening to my voice, you might be interested that alongside little bits and bobs and early access to videos, I also do a weekly audiobook, which is voted for by patrons, a Doctor Who novelization from my collection that I do a chapter from each week. So if you like the sounds of that, you can head on over.
All right. Well, let's also let everybody else do some plugging. Snowcone, where can folks find you out there on the wide internet?
On the world and wide internet, mostly just on Instagram right now, or on video game platforms. That's Snowcone83, or on Instagram, never_robot.
All right. Boingo, where are you out there on the internet?
Twitch.tv/Boingo Rider, YouTube at Boingo Rider, Boingo Rider or Boingo_Rider on most social media platforms. I'm pretty much anywhere I can be.
All right. And I am the Vacuuminator. I make YouTube videos. They're things I'm kind of proud of. You can find them on YouTube at the Vacuuminator, just sort of vlog-style discussions of various content I'm a fan of. And you can also find me on the various social medias. I'm on Bluesky at thevacuuminator.bsky.social. I'm on Instagram at @the_vacuuminator. And I'm on Tumblr, thevacuuminator.tumblr.com. Folks, that is going to do it for this week's edition of Modular Components. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. We hope to see you back here next week.